Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SITREP. SITREP is an notorious open source intelligence app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SITREP, for sponsoring this episode.
Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Matt.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias. And today we are joined again by John, our military expert, also known as Defense Bulletin, who's going to give us a further update and deep dive analysis on the latest military situation related to the war with Iran involving the United States and Israel. John, first, thank you so much again for joining us at the Bluff. Your military expertise is well needed in this very important conversation. So I'll start off with kind of an open-ended question for you based on our last conversation we had a couple of weeks ago. What is kind of the main military changes you've seen in the last 2 weeks since we last did our episode? What are the things that's standing out to you? And where do you think this conflict is heading within the next couple of weeks as well? So John, pass it on to you.
Yeah, thanks. First off, thanks for having me again, guys. Always great to be on here. I think the main military changes, or the changes in the operational dynamic that we've seen so far, has been the nature of the Iranian strikes. Well, maybe the nature of the targets, that is, of Iranian strikes. We're seeing them increasingly begin to strike their Gulf nation critical infrastructure. So that's now they say this is in response to strikes on their critical infrastructure as well. But we're beginning to see them strike oil and gas infrastructure increasingly. They're targeting international airports as well increasingly. Their targeting is also getting better too. And this comes as reports continue to fly in that both Russia and now China as well, I think as of today, is providing them intelligence, whether that's using intelligence via space-based assets, targeting data for U.S. bases and infrastructure in the Gulf region as well. That is one dynamic change that we've seen so far. And I think the second biggest one happened in the past couple of days, and that's the Houthis' entrance into the conflict, albeit limited, right? It's not the entrance that some may have expected if they were going to enter. And it's honestly best for the global economy that they have not entered in the way they have. They've so far sequestered their strikes to only Israel, as I understand it. They've not launched strikes in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, Gulf of Oman, or the Red Sea yet. Now, I don't know if that's the Houthis once again we can get into that maybe later, kind of the Houthi decision-making process here and what's going through their minds. But the Houthis have now joined the conflict. The last operational thing that I would also say here, and this may be more on the tactical level, is the loss of an E-3 ISR AEW early warning aircraft. So I think those are the biggest two ones right there.
One of the things that, I just maybe give my opinion and see, John, if you agree or disagree. I really think, well, number one, I think it's important to know if we're going to analyze this from a historical military perspective. Number one, what's very noteworthy is that Iran has not been able to effectively shoot down a manned U.S. aircraft over Iranian airspace. They've shot down over a dozen MQ-9 drones. There was a damaged F-35, maybe even possibly a F-18, although that's also been kind of denied. That's up in the air. The F-35 has been confirmed. But we haven't seen any successful shoot downs of really American air assets over the airspace of Iran. And if we're analyzing this from the 91 Gulf War, which I think is the closest historical example, at least the air campaign, right, where we saw in 1991 the U.S. air campaign against Saddam Hussein after his invasion of Kuwait, and we're just going to focus on that compared it to now. It's very interesting that Saddam Hussein has had more success in shooting down American aircraft and jets over Iraqi airspace than what the Iranians have been able to do. And even if you were to include the losses of the MQ-9 and the loss of an E-3 and the accidental crash of a KC-135, there looks like maybe another KC-35 might have been destroyed also in Prince Sultan Air Base. Numbers-wise, Saddam Hussein shot down more. I mean, up to 50, I think, aircrafts were shot down. And I just think that's very interesting, right? That maybe is there a situation where we're overestimating Iranian military capabilities, which I would be honest, I'm falling more in that camp, that there's an overestimation of Iranian military capabilities. And then I think the strike in Pisa, what's noteworthy is I think people are focusing this in the wrong lens, in the sense that I've seen a lot of take on X comparing this to Russia-Ukraine. And I have a fundamental problem set with that analysis. And the reason why that's a different war. What is the priority of the United States right now in Iran? Is to maintain air supremacy and air superiority over Iran to enable continued strikes over the country. We've even seen them stop using standoff munitions and using just normal JDAMs, et cetera, right? Going really into Iranian airspace, right? So to maintain that air superiority, there's not that many air bases that the United States can operate in the Middle East. I mean, we've seen a lot of the air bases closer to the Persian Gulf, like in Qatar, Ayutthaya Air Base, Bahrain, UAE. Those were largely evacuated. But the U.S. can't really operate in many other areas in the Middle East. PSAB in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan is another example. And as such, I think people are missing the point that CENTCOM knows that this is a threat, but they have to assume the risk because their main effort is air security. And the concern I think that people are missing is from CENTCOM's perspective is if we disperse our assets, we can lose the initiative and lose the sustainment and logistical support to maintain air superiority. I mean, this has been a conscious decision by CENTCOM. And to be honest, after 30 days of war, this is the first ballistic missile strike that has destroyed on the ground U.S. Air Force assets. Yes, there were some of the radars at the beginning of the war that really didn't degrade too much the U.S.'s ability to intercept it. But here, and I think the CENTCOM is just going to say, in a way, the losses we anticipated for a major military operation to this magnitude against Iran that had the largest ballistic missile force and drone force in the Middle East, that Russia copied their models and their way of warfare to use against Ukraine. I think CENTCOM is saying it's actually less than we anticipated, and I just feel like that's getting lost. And in this analysis and the debate is people are missing what is the end state and what is the main effort of the U.S. It's air superiority, so they have to assume certain risks. And but at the same time, I mean, this is a good opportunity. We've seen actually before we went live recording this episode on March 30th, the Iranian foreign minister released the image of the E3 being destroyed and saying, "Oh, well, Saudi Arabia, we're brotherly nations, but you're leveraging the Americans to attack our country, and that's why we have to conduct strikes." So obviously, it gives them that information warfare perspective. But if we're analyzing this from a purely military perspective, I don't understand why people. Maybe I'm wrong, and John, if you disagree, by all means, are not looking at the current conflict and saying, "Wait a minute, Saddam Hussein had better success in '91, and we're not willing to acknowledge that right now."
Yeah, I think that's hugely important to note. I actually just put out a tweet earlier today, and the gist of it, I said something along the lines of it should be understood that strictly from an operational standpoint, the loss of high-end ISR-AEW aircraft pales in comparison to the degradation of Iran's conventional capabilities. And then compounded on that is the degradation of their ability to reconstitute battle damage systems and battle losses at scale, right? Just today, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said, and this is if we're believing this, right? Said that 70% of their Iran's missile, drone, and shipbuilding production capacity has been destroyed or heavily damaged, right? So Iran, whereas, right, with the loss of a ISR-AW aircraft that arguably we've been phasing out for the past couple of years anyway, we've been phasing out that fleet in lieu of some more high-end systems, newer systems, right? It pales in comparison to that. And I do think it is something that people are kind of glossing over. And I think in some respects here, Iran is winning that information war, at least that aspect of it that you just mentioned earlier. Because every time the U.S. loses its system, whether it's to Iranian hostile Iranian fire or friendly fire, it's portrayed as this big loss to the U.S. operation. Whereas the U.S. operation has been able to scale up or scale down the tempo of strikes on Iran at will here, and losses of MQ-9s or AEW aircraft or the few F-15s that were shot down in friendly fire incidents has not put any type of jinx in the gears of the ongoing Operation Epic Fury to date here. I think we kind of saw the same thing back last year when the Houthis were continually shooting down MQ-9 Reapers as well in the same manner of fashion that Iran is. But the fact remains clear here that the U.S. and Israel do maintain high levels of air superiority over Iran. I believe a video surfaced a couple of days ago of a B-2 bomber being refueled in broad daylight above an Iranian city by a KC-135 Stratotanker. You don't do things like that in any battle space if you don't have air superiority. And I think this is something that you rightly mentioned is being glossed over.
I think one of the problems that the reason that Iran is having more success, I think, in messaging and being able to reach that audience is the failure of the administration to properly message, and they're giving that latitude for Iran to move in, because without that message, these these are things that people can point to. So if they haven't developed a strong domestic support for the war within the United States, all of a sudden you have a price tag that people are talking about. And every one of these items is something that is visual and tangible. And with the back and forth in terms of putting a pause on it, for 5 days, and the changing narrative just allows them the information space to operate within, where people are feeling uncertain. And so I think it would behoove the administration to find better messengers in terms of defining what success looks like. Because without doing that, again, you leave that information space open.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting you mentioned that. What does success look like here? Because this goes back all the way to the beginning of the war when there was a big hubbub, and we talked about this in the prior episode. Kind of what are the strategic, what are the operational goals here, and then kind of the gray area that we find ourselves in when it comes to trying to figure those out. Um, and I think the messaging has been very wishy-washy, for lack of a better term, from the administration here. We've seen them kind of walk back demands and move forward on demands, and just today we saw Marco Rubio go in the news and kind of put forward some of the same demands we've seen in the past, right? They're not going to have a nuclear weapon. They're not going to control the Strait of Hormuz. But it seems like the U.S. operational demands, the U.S. demands for talks now, we can get into that later as well, kind of just shift as the Iranians say things, right? The Iranians say something, the U.S. is like, absolutely not. This is now a demand, right? And then the Iranians, vice versa, will do the exact same thing here when the U.S. say, hey, these are our demands. The Iranians say, absolutely not, and then they fire back with other demands, or they just deny the talks are even ongoing, right? And so signal messaging has been a huge problem for the administration. We're seeing, things being confirmed, right? In my capacity working with the defense team at OSINT Defender, right? We've had CENTCOM in our DMs, telling us directly, hey, this isn't true what you just said, and then not necessarily reneging it, but it then comes out that okay, yeah, this strike on this base did heavily damage XYZ, right? And I think the messaging is a huge problem here. And I think if they could get in front of it a little more, they have started to shift a little bit in the right direction when it comes to reporting on U.S. casualties. They seem to be using the CNN as the primary outlet for releasing that information every couple of days. So far, I believe it's been every other day for the past week and a half. We're getting updated casualty numbers. But in the first week and 2 weeks of the war, we weren't getting any information on casualty numbers. So those things are hugely important to stay um, in front of, I think. And then there's also just the general version to Donald Trump within the United States, right? We're kind of split down the middle politically here. It's a very polar political scene here. And so it's very easy, like you mentioned, for Iran to appeal to people who kind of have this Trump averse attitude, right? Who are not going to see anything that Donald Trump does, whether the operation is going extremely great, like on Venezuela, great, or whether it's going extremely bad, they're not going to be supportive of it regardless, right? And I think Iran is having great success at kind of influencing this half of the population, right? We saw just today that they had these no kings protests again, right? And so Iran responds by writing no kings on their ballistic missiles and posting it before they fire them off. Someone jokingly said they'll probably be fired at UAE bases anyway, but I thought that was kind of funny. But this is that kind of messaging campaign we're seeing. CENTCOM will release things showing B2s getting refueled, B-52s getting refueled, and stuff like that. But that really only appeals to people like us, right? The military geeks or the people who are the IR guys who are watching this conflict, right? But to everyday person, they could care less whether or not a video of, a cool looking photo or a video of a B-52 Stratofortress getting refueled over Iran, which something is a historical moment for us, right? But for everyday people, could care less. And so I think the messaging thing is a huge thing that is mentioned that you guys just mentioned there.
Actually, let me ask you this question. This was from again while we were right before we recorded from the New York Times. I'd like your take on this because I think it's a very interesting aspect. I was just on a space and I kind of highlighted this before this article released. And the New York Times is reporting Iran's fractured leadership is struggling to coordinate. Officials says. As leaders are killed and replaced, Iranian negotiators may not know what their government is willing to concede in negotiations. And then what it's saying is the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran has fractured the Iranian government, complicating its ability to make decisions and coordinate larger retaliatory attacks, according to officials familiar with U.S. and Western intelligence assessments. Several dozen Iranian leaders and their deputies have been killed since the war began 4 weeks ago. Those who survived had difficulty communicating and are unable to meet in person for fear of having their calls intercepted by the U.S. or Israel and being targeted in an airstrike. I, I mean, I think there's an immediate concern of that what this article is highlighting, right? Obviously, this immediate aspect of this degradation, not only from a negotiation perspective, from a command and control as well. And I think we've kind of seen that. I mean, that's been kind of a common theme that we've kind of hit upon in multiple either spaces or podcast episodes. So, I mean, I think we need to focus on that. But I mean, long term, I think one of the things that are not necessarily getting talking about, and maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself in this conversation, but it's like this degradation can have significant impact on any post-war Iranian government, whatever they might look like. And I think it's not only an Israeli objective. President Trump has made this abundantly clear that this is objective as well. And he's kind of alluded to this of like, well, who is the regime? Who we don't know who we're talking to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, we've eliminated the leadership, so it's regime change by design. And people might kind of walk away from that. But I think we're seeing this, and this report from the New York Times really highlights significant problems, I think, that the Islamic Republic is having right now in the immediate future and post-war governance that I don't think is necessarily getting a lot of talk about. We talk about the internal divisions in the United States, but it pales in comparison to what we're seeing in Iran.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's great, right? Because the IRGC, whether or not they're expunged from Iranian political spheres or not, right? They're going to be severely weakened after this conflict. They're severely weakened now, right? That's why we see increasing people who could be viewed as more moderate and less so with these hardline clerics speaking out, and then the hardline clerics speak out, and then they kind of walk back their statements and things like that. We mentioned this in the earlier podcast of the Iranian president made some statements that they viewed as weak, and then he walked those back, right? And we've been seeing this for weeks now, right? This kind of give and then this take from principal Iranian decision makers. And I think what we're actively seeing here is due to the breakdown of that intragovernmental communication framework in Iran because of the strikes, where we're seeing this not necessarily infighting, but we're seeing the decision-making process get even more muddy than it already was, right? I think it was more so of a straight line under Khamenei. And I think because he created this parallel framework for the IRGC, and this is actually ironically one way that the IRGC has stayed alive throughout all this, is because they are a parallel governance framework to other things like the parliament or like the Artesh. They're like a second center of gravity, right, for Iran. We're now seeing some sort of, I guess you could call it infighting now, on how to move forward here. And then because these communication frameworks are broken down so much, it's hard for them to decide on a way to move forward with any type of synchronization at all here. And that goes from everything from moving forward to negotiation for whether or not they should increase or decrease the tempo of their strikes, to the nature of the targets that they should be picking. Who decides what targets are they picking in their Gulf neighbors, U.S. based in infrastructure, and also in Israel as well. I think likely the only thing that they can agree on without fail is likely that we're going to continue to strike Israel. But we've been seeing a lot of give and take when it comes to the targeting of their Gulf neighbors. And I think you rightly mentioned earlier, kind of the kind of double signaling from Iranian decision makers, especially when it comes to Saudi Arabia. I mean, calling you a brotherly nation when 2 hours ago you just fired, a total of, within the 2 hour period, of 12 ballistic missiles and something near 20 drones at critical infrastructure and air bases across Saudi Arabia. It seems a bit hypocritical to me and facetious at best, right? And so we're seeing this kind of double signaling that I think is a result of that breakdown of the communication frameworks that you just mentioned.
I have to imagine that that's going to be, at least in the near term, very frustrating. There's also a risk of, a more uh, decentralized decision structure in terms of what Iran is trying to accomplish. But at some point, and I think maybe this was mentioned in one of our previous conversations around this, but not knowing who's going to be there to pick up the phone makes it very difficult to negotiate. And I think we're also facing, some of these concerns for people to step into those spaces, lest they themselves become a target. What I think this is also leading to, or it's been reported that some officials are concerned that the IRGC is becoming a little bit more influential, and we're seeing some of that through like the domestic crackdowns. And what is their position going to be if they survive this? It's probably going to be more hardline.
Actually, but if I can jump in though, I think I think the fracturing is by design. I think that's the goal. But I would be very cautious. We were talking about this earlier, and I think there's a tendency right now inside of Iran when we're analyzing the domestic situation inside of Iran, which is very difficult because of just the information blackout and obviously the control of the state media, et cetera. But I would be very cautious from framing the current Iranian political spectrum just in the context of hardliners and reformists and viewing the IRGC as a unitary group. I think there's even camps within the IRGC that are forming. And I think it's either from a political or even a personality based order. And I think we just need to be very careful assuming that just because the IRGC is gaining influence, there's this idea that it's across the board unitary hardliners are the ones who are doing it, rather than fractures even within the IRGC themselves and defeating competing aspects, either from a bureaucratic or personal or ideological base. And I think that is something that is not being given enough attention and focus that we just don't understand. So the assumption then is, well, the hardliners are getting power. And I think that's a huge leap, and we're ignoring the possibility that there's even fractures within not only the the reformists, but even the hardliners, and that is also something that it benefits the United States and Israel's national security objectives instead of Iran. You know, and we had this conversation in the previous phase, and I think the interesting aspect, I mean, you can kind of see this with Garibov, right? I mean, the Iranian Speaker of Parliament, who's been identified as a hardliner. Yet there's been outrage even within pro IRGC communication channels of the way that Guy is handling this negotiation. And he has been always been labeled as one of these hardliners close to the IRGC, and they're criticizing him. And it's interesting that, again, there is an Iranian president who basically doesn't exist. And he wants to be, it looks like the US is leveraging him to be the next president. But does that mean the IRGC as a whole or fractured will also agree with that? And I think we're just overlooking that. I was just done with this. It's very interesting. We have our own, intelligence model. Imagine a chat GPT, right, for geopolitical analysis that really focuses on geopolitical analysis. We call it Harmonia. And we were running the test bed. And it's very interesting. If you ask Grok, if you ask GPT, you ask all these others, they're much more positive in the outcome of the Islamic Republic, the regime surviving. Ours is not. It does not have large faith in the Islamic Republic. Right. And one of the things that framed it is that the problem that is running into right now in Iran is fracturings within all these different cliques and groups to the point where there's not going to be necessarily a predominant player at the end of this war. And saying that is a huge risk that Iran happens. And I think that's by design. That is exactly what the United States wants to do. That's exactly what Israel wants to do. And I think we're just glossing over those internal domestic tensions inside of Iran and prioritizing and focusing much more on the U.S., enabling the Iranians to have that information warfare kind of narrative and win in the information space.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned the parliamentary speaker there, right? Because so he was identified by Western analysts a while ago, and kind of has been for a while, as being the most person that's, I mean, sorry, not the most person, the person that the Trump administration would be most likely to, or any U.S. administration to approach, were we to see some type of regime change in Iran here. Because while he is deemed as a hardliner, he's oftentimes put in the past years or decades has been put in front of Western press, put in front of Western conventions and other things to kind of speak from Iran's point of view to the West, right? He's the one who is constantly in communication with Western nations the most, and so he has the most experience dealing with this. And so it is interesting that you mentioned that it's highly likely there is a possibility of intra IRGC fracturing here. And what I think one line of contact that we might see fracturing, or if we haven't already seen it here within the IRGC, is those people who you could label as zealots and those who more so concerned about the survival of the IRGC as a political and military force within Iran here, right? And I think the interesting thing about your guys' intelligence model, right, is that it possibly factoring in things like this, right? If the IRGC uh, uses their influence over the Iranian governmental framework right now to not only drag out talks but drag out this war, the increasing likelihood of them not surviving this conflict, right? It goes up, right? And so um, I think it would behoove the IRGC to kind of end this conflict in some way. They're not going to end up on top here, but they can frame it in the same way the Houthis framed, right, the Donald Trump ending strikes on them as a huge win. Iran can do this right now, right, if they wanted to, right? And we're already seeing them. Every time Donald Trump comes out with a statement, we see social media blow up, at least the pro IRGC side of social media blow up. Oh, we won, they're retreating. I mean, how many times have we seen them say they fired missiles at us and then we retreated from the waters of XYZ? And so, I do think that there are these kind of zealots who are like, let's just keep going, for lack of a better term, balls to the wall until, we're either all dead, or they're all dead, right? But I think there's a more pragmatic group within the IRGC who understands that the longer that this conflict drags on, the less likely it is that they survive it, or the more likely it is that other factions within either the IRGC or other factions within the Artesh or the parliament or other principal decision makers gain more influence by within through negotiations with the U.S. Or other Gulf nations and kind of get more influence through these
Actually, let me
measures.
let me read you what it said yesterday, and Matt. I'll go to you. Sorry for taking this, but I think this is kind of like it basically says it's a low. I'm not going to read the percentages, obviously, because that's proprietary or that, but it says low probability of regime survival. The two reasons why it says this is number one, leadership cohesion is lacking. It's suffering significantly from leadership cohesion, and then it says internal security is the major factor, and this kind of lists out everything. And then what it says, like, when we ask it, what is the like likely to happen in Iran if regime collapses, like what are we looking like, what will happen? It says a single successor entity is unlikely. And what it says is the collapse will produce a power vacuum and state fragmentation, not a clean transition. The immediate aftermath will likely be a violent power struggle between competing IRGC elements, organized opposition movements, and emboldened ethnic militias. It says public maneuvering from both Mohammed Khamenei, diaspora mobilization, you're seeing with Pahlavi, obviously with the CPAC conversations, represents pre-positioning by factions, but neither appear capable of consolidating nationwide control. And that is again, it really highlights this idea that we should not be analyzing Iran, and this is what I love about Harmonian and kind of put this into place. It's like you cannot analyze this as the IRGC as a single entity in any way, shape, or form, and we're ignoring the possibility of different factions within broader context of the Iranian political entities fragmenting and competing more against each other and undermining each other within the broader strategic environment, specifically related to the negotiations with the United States. But Matt, I'll push it on to you.
Well, so first, I think, there is also a discussion to be had as to whether or not a fractured Iran emerging from this is a good thing. Um, I would argue that it's not, and it creates a whole lot of uncertainty, and a lot of potential for this conflict expanding and becoming something that is ongoing, just in ways that we can't necessarily anticipate. So I would say that. But second, my point in terms of the analysis on the IRGC, I do think it's interesting, and it should be something that is examined and accounted for, and we should try and find as much, evidence. It should be something that I think analysts are watching to see if those cracks, are forming within the IRGC itself. The point I was making was more about the hard line on negotiations that we're seeing, and I think that's why we're able to read some frustration coming out of the U.S. camp in terms of how those are going. And I think the people who at least are leading those conversations right now are reluctant to make concessions. And that is the leadership within the IRGC that I was referencing. And I think that is why we're seeing some of these frustrations. I also think that by prolonging this and with them taking that harder line, it's making it difficult for the United States to have those conversations in a meaningful way. And I think the goal here, and we've seen this with how Trump has kind of been timing a lot of, the discussions about what's going on with the markets, putting a 5 delay pause while the markets are opening or are open. I think, the damage that is being done economically is real and significant. And the longer it takes for the strait to become reopened, the longer we're going to be feeling the consequences of that. So I don't know if that is the game they're playing, but the analysis that I've been reading around the IRGC maybe becoming more important had more to do with the current negotiations and how they are taking more power from sort of the religious leaders in shaping the contours of those conversations.
Yeah, and I do believe that that is happening here. I do think that any factions within Iran that do want to kind of negotiate their way out of this war are being kind of railroaded off of the tracks here by our elements within the IRGC, more of these towards the line of zealot elements within the IRGC, right? Because I agree with you, Stefano, that there definitely is some more pragmatic decision makers within the IRGC, but I don't think these are the guys leading the decision from Iran's side here uh, at all here. And what I think evidence of that is, well, I mean, sorry, I think that them continue principal decision makers who are more moderate continually coming out saying things that are more pragmatic in nature and then walking them back, or Iran actually doing things differently, right? Saying one thing and doing the other here is evidence of that the RGC is the one kind of leading, or at least the more hardliners are the ones kind of leading the pack here, at least when it comes to negotiations and actions as well here. And that now that's in the near term right now. I couldn't positively say what's going to happen here in the long term, but we will likely see those fractures that you guys mentioned continue to widen as this conflict goes on. And that's a caveat. I mean, not a caveat, but an add-on to that is it will become more likely that those fractions will widen as Israel continues to kill more principal decision makers or sub-principal decision makers within the IRGC as well. So,
And that kind of brings me to a question in terms of sort of a divergence between um, the United States strategy and that Israel has adopted. And what is your read on that? And then I would also just like to kind of get your takes on what, the day after looks like if this does result in a divided Iran.
Actually, and if I may just quickly add a different element to that question for Matt, because we got reporting today from the Associated Press that has been matched by reporting all there that claims that Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and Kuwait are all advocating to President Trump right now to continue this military war, even to the and to commit ground troops. They kind of complain we were caught off guard, but now this is the moment. Like that, this is the time. Let's end this. And so we're also seeing the GCC in many aspects, maybe Qatar less, obviously, in Oman less, but the GCC as a whole is taking a very hawkish approach against Iran and leveraging their diplomatic influence with President Trump to really continue this war. And I just wanted to bring that up outside of just the U.S. Israel. I think we're seeing the GCC as well. But to you, John.
yeah, I'll start with Israel first here. I think this is something I probably should have mentioned at the outset. One of the biggest dynamic changes we've seen so far, and one of those is the divergence on operational, outlooks here and strategic outlooks between the United States and Israel. I believe it was earlier this week, we got news that Vice President J.D. Vance held a call with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and essentially said, your operational strategic outlooks for the early part of this war is going to go were not realistic, right? The idea that they were going to kill Khamenei and then everything was just going to topple, right? People, take power, Pahlavi would be in there or whatever, right? He communicated this in so many words to Benjamin Netanyahu. And it's interesting, we didn't really receive much reporting on how Netanyahu responded to that, but we kind of get an idea of how he responded to that because Israel, the tempo of Israeli strikes on Iranian critical infrastructure and then also Iranian infrastructure, as a whole, increased significantly, two, maybe even threefold, and it was already at a high tempo already. I believe they even conducted 900 sorties in one day, which is a hell of a lot, right? And it all indicators point that they're only increasing them, and they've expanded their war in Lebanon here. I think Israel, where we're seeing the main divergence here is Israel just sees this as an opportunity to kind of just bomb Iran into oblivion, and then also expand their operations in Lebanon here too. And I think this is also pissing off the United States here too a bit, because now it's causing friction with Gulf, other Arab and Gulf states as well here, right? Because we just saw actually like less than an hour ago a joint statement come out with Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and etc., decrying Israel's, historical, use of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, their expansion of their operations in Lebanon, and then also their ongoing operations in the Gaza Strip, right? This has been something they've been pretty consistent with here, but they're continually coming out with these statements saying, hey, Israel, we're not happy with this. Hey, we're not happy with this. And so I think now that we're seeing this war continue on and Israel just kind of continuing on, like it's the same day as the first day, continuing to bomb, continuing to strike uh, principal decision makers as they see them. And actually, I believe it had to be communicated to them by U.S. decision makers. Hey, you can't strike these certain people. I mean, we saw Trump give that because we're trying to negotiate with them. And if you keep killing people, it's harder and harder for us to negotiate, right? Which lends credence to what Stefano, you were talking about earlier, is how it's harder for them to negotiate because of these communication blockages and from these decapitation strikes. And that's something that's been hampering our efforts here. And I think Israel and the US just fundamentally want different things from this war. I think Israel wants an Iran that is never again going to be able to threaten it, right? Supposedly, right? And the US just needs Iran not to be able to project power outside its borders uh, for the maybe not the short term, but in the near term, long term, for lack of a better term here, so that we can pivot to the Indo-Pacific, Europe, or whatever that is, or this Western Hemispheric defense plan that we have ongoing, right? And so it's interesting where we're seeing this divergence between Israel and the United States, because we've seen this before, right? We saw this with strikes on the Houthis, where they were beginning to strike oil infrastructure where we didn't necessarily want to do that at that point in time, right? And then we started to do it. And so I think Israel kind of always goes for the 100%, goals, whereas we have more uh, uh, tiered goals and staged goals here. And so where we're seeing this play out here again, um,
Actually, John,
after hearing that comment, yeah.
let me ask you a question, a follow up to that, because there was an interesting report, I believe it was either today or yesterday, that indicated that the Israeli Defense Force basically assessed that, like, from their military targets, they've kind of really hit everything they wanted to hit, right? And obviously there's going to be the strikes against the besieged guys and the RGC ground forces and the ground elements, et cetera. But those military capabilities from the ballistic missile, the nuclear facilities, those have largely been done. And outside of the targeted strikes against these internal security elements, which interestingly enough, actually caveat to that, the Israeli Persian account, the official Twitter account or X account of the Israeli government Persian language, claim that since Friday they've managed to kill 2,000, what they said, quote, suppression forces, which is basically the besieged and the police. So those types of operations are going to continue. But outside of these major military infrastructure, since those are done, the IDF actually is recommending, and Benjamin Netanyahu agrees, and he's pitching this idea to President Trump, is let's go after their economic interests, because that's a key element to cause the regime collapse. And it would be interesting to see maybe, President Trump in his Truth Social kind of alluded to this earlier today, where he's going to give the Iranians time to negotiate, but if they're not, they're going to start expanding to those economic, electric, and oil infrastructure. But it looks like the Israeli government wants to go here because they view that as a significant deathbed for the ability of Iran to continue to survive. And the strikes against the steel facilities in Iran done by Israel, we got reporting from the New York Times, I believe it was, or Reuters, from an Iranian official saying this is going to cause huge problems after this war for our economy. And so is that something, John, that we might start seeing much more expansive strikes on economic infrastructure, similar to what we see between Russia and Ukraine? Is that the next wave of strikes that we might see either done by the Israelis or maybe even the U.S. against Iran?
Yeah, so as of right now, right, given the current discussion on the matter within the United States, that is, um, on striking critical infrastructure inside Iran, discussions on whether or not it's a war crime and other things like that. I think the U.S. right now, as of right now, is happy to maybe go that route by with and through Israel, right? Kind of how we saw them do used Israel in the past with the Houthis, and then also to strike, Iran in the past, right? Uh, Kind of using Israel, as kind of an arm to conduct strike like this. And the biggest indicator of whether or not the U.S. is given like some sort of tacit approval to do this is whether or not we see a significant up tempo in strikes on critical Iranian infrastructure. We've already seen one, but I think we should see more. I don't think the U.S. is right now ready to go that route, especially with the way how Donald Trump is championing negotiations, right? And this is obviously important to note, right? Because the Iranians have said, as part of these negotiations, something that they have said multiple times, and even outside the framework of negotiations, that if you continue to strike our critical infrastructure, we'll strike Gulf nation critical infrastructure as well. Um, Now, whether or not that's going to make Gulf nations reticent to back a ground invasion or continue strikes on Iran, that remains to be seen here. But I think as of right now, the U.S. will only give tacit approval for that to Israel to increase the tempo of their strikes on critical infrastructure.
No, I think that's the key aspect, right? And I think that's the day after. And John, I guess before we end this, I'd like to give you the opportunity. Like, what do you think is the day after for Iran? How does the regime survive? Does it get more hardliner? Do we see fracturing? Do we see a civil war? What do you think? I mean, I know it's hard, but what do you believe right now is your best assessment currently? What this might look like at the end?
Yeah, I think what a day after depends on two biggest things, whether or not the regime survives, right? I think if the regime survives, we see a more hardline regime. Now, also, what aspects of the regime survive here, right? Who, like you mentioned earlier, who comes out on top, right? There's going to be, regardless of the whether I mean, if the regime survives, one thing is guaranteed that there's going to be some level of a power struggle internally, right? Because we heard the reports in the past couple of weeks that Khamenei's son is not necessarily the scion of power that Iran would love to make him. Right? He's not necessarily seen as very um, uh, politically smart, and he's not. I don't want to say seen as a dud, but there are going to be people who are willing to try and not necessarily put him out of power, but use him as a pawn for other means. And so we're going to see if the regime survives. It's highly likely we'll see some level of a political struggle for leadership within the RGC specifically, and whether or not that bleeds into higher level decision making roles, that remains to be seen as well. Then there's the other one where the IRGC somehow topples and falls, and that's going to take a considerable amount of not only strikes but likely troops on the ground or some level of an uprising within Iran here to wipe out obviously Ba'athist security forces, IRGC themselves, and then you have the Artesh, right? What side are they taking here as well? They're also like the biggest odd man out here, understanding, what are they doing in all of this here, other than getting bombed for that matter, right? But if the regime were to topple, like you mentioned earlier, it creates this huge vacuum of power. And Iran is home to many different ethnicities, and it's very likely that it could fall into sectarian violence. I'm not saying on the level uh, um, of like Syria or something like that, because there's still going to be these other parallel governmental frameworks here. Obviously, there are attached other things like this, and the parliamentary system here. And it'll be interesting to see which decision maker comes out on top here. But regardless, one thing is always going to be true here, that there's going to be a struggle for power regardless, and it's highly likely it'll bleed out to other Gulf states as well. I think it seems so far that these Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, Kuwait, they're willing to kind of deal with this fallout should it happen here, because they're pushing the United States to either conduct a ground operation and or increase strikes. So that's kind of my outlook for the day after, or the year after, or the years after.
Yeah, I think, for one of the future topics, in very near future topics, it would be interesting to take a look at the Gulf countries, as well as looking at the Houthis. And I think the Houthis would actually make a good use case, and or case study of how we've seen them unified in the past, but how uh, longer conflicts, protracted conflicts, can start to show some of those cracks start to form.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think one thing that I did want to mention on the Houthi before I left is that the Houthis, like as we mentioned earlier in the episode, they have joined the war, but they've stopped short at striking target commercial and naval shipping in the Bab el Mandeb, Red Sea, and Gulf of Oman, right? Of Oman. And I think that's hugely important to note here because, like I said earlier, in the last episode, the Houthis are like Iran's greatest success and also their greatest failure, right? Because they're essentially like a state entity now. They built up this non-state actor to essentially become a state entity now. But now, kind of with this influence, with this agency that the Houthis now have, also comes, uh, you know, more, well, I mean, with this increased, power that the Houthis have, ability to project power from their shores, also comes some agency as well. And I think that's partially why we're seeing the Houthis reticent to fully commit to a war for Iran, because they would see it as just, political and physical suicide for that matter.
And I think that will be an excellent point to leave this conversation with. And it really gives us a great picking up point here in the coming weeks. So with that, this has been the bottom line up front, and we will talk to you again soon.